Hi, Adam Gower here, and welcome to the Gower Crowd podcast syndication in the digital age at gowercrowd.com. Now, as you probably know, this is actually the third series of podcasts that I have been producing, and the first series, when I first actually started getting into digital marketing of any kind, was focused on professors at major universities who had written about real estate topics. And what they would tell me, despite the excellence of their research and the value that it actually held for the industry, they would tell me that maybe on a good day, 12 people would read their papers. It's really crazy. So it was a really fabulous opportunity to be able to get their work out to an industry, to the industry they were writing about that really benefited from their efforts. Well, today I'm going to be introducing you to another professor, Professor Jonah Berger, who is at Wharton, who has, are you sitting down, 195,000 followers on LinkedIn. This is a professor who really needs no introduction, right? And as you would imagine, he lives what he teaches. He is a professor in marketing over there at Wharton. You're going to love it. He's going to talk about his book today, Catalyst, How to Change Anyone's Mind. So I'll defer to him on that. But in the meantime, please go to gowercrowd.com. You can check out a link to his website, Professor Berger's website, to his book, etc., on the podcast page for today's episode, where you can also find a link to my new book, Syndicate, where I reveal all the secrets that we have uncovered building some of the most sophisticated digital marketing systems for sponsors, raising capital online. Syndicate, it's there on the website, on gowercrowd.com. It comes with a free 72-minute training from yours truly, personally, going through all the secrets in great detail. You're going to absolutely love it. All there at gowercrowd.com. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jonah Berger to talk about his book, Catalyst. Professor Berger, thank you so very much for joining me on my podcast today. You are a world-renowned author and speaker, and you have a new book out, Catalyst. And what I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, is there's actually, in the blurb for that book, there is a comment that says, marketers want to change their customers' minds. But my question to you actually, if I may, is do we want to change their minds? Or do we not just actually want them to think the way that we think? Do we not want to educate them to think the way we think? Is that something different, or is that the same thing?
You know, the question you bring up at its core is a very interesting one, right? And when we think about changing minds, we tend to take the perspective you just talked about, right? I want to get someone to think the way that I think, which is okay, but it's a very egocentric way to think about change and behavior, right? Let me think about what I want and let me see if I can get other people there. What I talk about in the book, really at its core, is that pushing doesn't work, right? Whether we're pushing people to take our perspective, customer or client, we push them to take our perspective, whether we're pushing a boss or a colleague to see our point of view, or we're trying to get a family member to come around and take a particular action. We often think if we just give people more information, more facts, more figures, as you said, they'll come around to see our way of thinking. But there's a problem with that, which is pushing often doesn't work. If you think about a chair in the middle of a room, for example, pushing is a great way to get that chair to move. You push a chair in a particular direction, it goes. When you push people, though, they tend not to go. They tend to do the exact opposite of often what we want. And part of the reason why is because we're not understanding where they are at the moment, right? We're really coming after it from what we want, a very egocentric perspective, rather than thinking where they are at the moment. A good way to think about it is, great catalysts, great change agents don't say, well, what can I do to get someone to go where I want them to? Instead, they say, well, why hasn't that person done that already? What's stopping them? What's the barrier or obstacle that's in the way? And how can I mitigate or remove those barriers? And that's a subtle shift but a really important one. So as a marketer, for example, rather than saying, well, how can I educate the consumer so they make the same choice I want them to, ask a slightly different question. Why haven't they already made that choice? Is the issue an information issue where they don't have access to the right information? Is it that they have access to that information but don't believe that information? Do they believe it, but they think the product is too expensive? We can go through a variety of different barriers. But the point is not starting from us and where we are, starting from where them and where they are. I think sort of a good way to think about it is, if you've ever been parked on an incline in your car, you get in the car, you try to start it, you stick your key in the ignition, you push your foot on the gas. If the car doesn't go, we often just think we need more gas.
Right.
If the boss, if the colleague, if the person doesn't come around, we just think we need to push harder on the gas. If we just push them a little bit harder, they'll go. But often, many times, the parking brake's just up. And if we don't drop the parking brake, we can step on the gas as much as we want, but the car's not going to go anywhere. And so at the core, that's the idea of the book. What are those common parking brakes that come up again and again that prevent change from happening? How can we be better at identifying those parking brakes in our own lives and in our own journeys? And by understanding what the barriers are, remove them, and at the core, change anything.
So if I want to raise money from somebody online for my real estate project, and this is where we started off, and the way that we do it is that the way that we've thought about it is to provide enough educational content to draw people in, to attract them, actually to allow them to self-select, to come into our orbit, and then to provide them with enough information that they can consume at will what it is they want, so that they are predisposed to doing what we ask them to do at the end of the day. You talk about generating change. In that context, how do you do that? How do you assess what it is that that is the reason why somebody hasn't perhaps invested in real estate before? What is the process of assessing how somebody, why they've not acted in a certain way?
I'll give you a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it will be useful. So
Sure.
I talk about 5 barriers in the book: reactance, endowment, distance, uncertainty, and corroborating evidence. Put those 5 together, they spell the word reduce, which is exactly what great catalysts do. They don't push harder, they don't add more temperature, more pressure. They figure out what the barriers are and they reduce them. And I think one of the barriers you're talking about at the moment is reactance. And so let me tell you a little bit of a story about reactance, why reactance happens, and what we can do to solve reactance. And so to think about it, I actually want to start in a very different place, which is something many of us have used, or at least heard of, which is Tide Pods. Those little pods that you drop in the laundry to make laundry easier to do. So let me tell you a quick story about Tide Pods. So a number of years ago, Tide, owned by Procter & Gamble, was trying to figure out how to make more money from the laundry industry. They realized there was a problem with laundry. Laundry adding detergent at the beginning wasn't very efficient. It would be better if certain parts of the detergent were added at different stages of the wash. People didn't like getting sticky detergent on their hands. They didn't know exactly how much to put in, so they came up with these Tide Pods, spent over $100 million in marketing, thought they could take a big chunk of the over $1 billion laundry industry. So they released Tide Pods, and Tide Pods are doing okay, but then there's a problem. And that problem is that people are eating them. And I want to pause there for a second.
That's right. I remember that.
Aren't they filled with chemicals, right? I mean, what do you mean people are eating them?
Yeah.
No, people are eating them. So there's a funny video online. There's a satirical article. Suddenly, mostly young people are challenging one another to eat Tide Pods, called the Tide Pod Challenge. And so Tide is sitting there going, well, what do we do here, right? People shouldn't be eating these things, but just in case, we'll issue a press release saying don't eat them. We'll hire a couple of celebrities telling people don't eat them, lots of sort of public service announcements, and they think that'll be the end of it. But if you look at the data, something really interesting happens. So they start telling people don't eat Tide Pods, don't eat Tide Pods. But the exact opposite of what they want to happen occurs. Interest in the Tide Pod Challenge shoots up over 200%. Visits to poison control shoot up as well. Essentially, a warning became a recommendation. Telling people not to eat Tide Pods made people more likely to do it. And many of your listeners are sitting there going, hold on, I'm asking people to invest, not to invest. What does this example with Tide Pods have to do with me? Well, at the core, the reason why the Tide Pod Challenge happened was because people felt reactance. When pushed, people often push back. Whether we're trying to get people not to do something, like eat Tide Pods, or to do something, like invest in our venture, for example. When we push people, they often push back. People want to feel a sense of freedom and control. They want to feel like they're making choices because they made the decision themselves. Why did I buy this product, use this service, make this investment? I did it because I thought it was a good idea. But the more we push them, the more they feel like that choice is coming from us rather than them, which makes them less likely to do it. There's something called the anti-persuasion radar, basically a radar system that goes off when we feel like someone's trying to persuade us. We ignore the message, we avoid it, or even worse, we counter-argue. We think about all the reasons why what someone is suggesting is a bad idea. And so that's a quick summary of what reactance is. If any of you have a 3-year-old at home, you probably have experienced it. But then you're probably wondering, okay, well, how do we deal with that? And at the core, the idea of how to deal with that is stop trying to persuade people and get them to persuade themselves. Try to sell people and get them to buy in. And so how do you do that? And so in the book, I talk probably about 4 or 5 different strategies. I'll mention one here, which I think is really relevant to the question you asked about real estate investing. Often when we're making a presentation, we present an idea and we say, let me tell you how great this idea is. And we think it's great. And we provide a whole bunch of facts and figures and reasons and other things that suggest why it's great. But notice what the listener's doing while they're sitting there. They seem like they're listening. But as I mentioned, they really think about all the reasons why they don't think what we suggested will work. Well, sure, you would think this is a good investment. This is the area of the market you work in. You want me to invest with you. How do I know it's actually going to work? How do I know it's actually going to make money? Here's all the reasons why I shouldn't do it. But if you notice what great salespeople do and what great consultants do, they harness a technique called providing a menu. Very simply what they do.
Say that again. To call what? Providing
a menu.
A menu. Okay.
Yeah. Very simply, rather than giving people one option, which the listener sits there and they think about all the reasons what's bad about that one option. Instead, they provide multiple, 2 options, 3 options, not 25, but a few. And what that does is it shifts the role of the listener. Rather than sitting there and thinking about, well, I don't like this and this is why I don't like it, instead they're thinking, well, which one of these do I like better? And because they're sitting there thinking which one they like better, they're much more likely to choose one at the end of a meeting. And it's called a menu because it's very much like going to a restaurant, right? You go to a restaurant, they don't let you pick whatever you want. They give you a limited set of choices, in the sense a menu of options that you can choose from within. It's choosing the choice set, but because you're giving people that choice, they have the freedom and autonomy to choose within that option set, making them much more satisfied at the end. What you're doing is you're guiding the journey. You're not forcing them to do one thing or another. You're giving an opportunity to participate, but because they're participating, the decision is not coming from you, it's coming from within them, which reduces reactance and makes them much more likely to do what you hope they would do in the first place.
Fascinating. Now, how did these ideas translate to the online world? For somebody who's listening and who wants to market online, I'm not talking about paid ads, just in generally being online. How do these lessons apply in the online world? What are the kind of practical applications?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of examples all throughout the book of both online and offline folks, B2B and B2C folks, products, services, and ideas. What was really fun about writing this book is it's not just a business book. So, sure, I interviewed transformational leaders and top salespeople, but I also interviewed doctors who got patients to lose weight. I interviewed hostage negotiators who got people to come out with their hands up, substance abuse counselors who got people to quit, a rabbi who got people to renounce the KKK, a whole bunch of folks.
And buy Israel bonds. And buy Israel bonds.
Yeah. A whole bunch of people that got folks to change their mind in much more difficult situations than we often find ourselves. And they did that again because at the core, they understood what their audience was dealing with, right? Think about going to the doctor, for example. Right? When you go to the doctor doesn't say, well, let me put a cast on your leg, right? The doctor starts by saying, well, let me diagnose the problem. And only once I understand the problem do I prescribe the solution. And so in some sense, I don't talk about it this way, but you could think about it this way. One of the barriers is ourselves. We're so focused on what we want to achieve that we rarely think about the audience that we're trying to actually persuade. But the more we understand them, in marketing, we'd call this customer centricity, right? The more we understand the audience we're trying to communicate with and change, the more effective we can actually be.
Now, you talk about this idea, the 4th barrier, uncertainty. How does that figure into into this dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we all think about change, there are two things. There are the thing we're letting go of and the thing we're moving towards. And so the endowment chapter is really about letting go of what we're doing already, right? Often we're so stuck and attached to the things we're doing already that we're unable to let them go. Why is that? Many times because the status quo feels safe. I talk about the status quo bias, what it is, how to overcome it. But the uncertainty chapter is really the moving towards the new thing. Anytime we're asking people to do something new, there's some uncertainty. Take an investment, for example. Sure, you, the person pitching me on this investment, say it's a great investment, but how do I, the person listening to this potential investment, actually know that it's going to be good? It's different from what I've invested in the past. And so there's some uncertainty, some fear, some anxiety about that new thing. And so how do we overcome that anxiety? And so I think it helps to think about a company in a very different industry, which is Dropbox. So many of your listeners are probably familiar with Dropbox, the online storage solution. Rather than storing things on your desktop or so on, they store things in the cloud. And they're over $1 billion business at this point, been hugely successful. But it's tough to remember that they weren't like that originally, right? When Dropbox launched, very few people actually wanted to store things in the cloud. They didn't know what a cloud was. They didn't understand what it meant for something to be in the cloud. And they were used to seeing their documents on their desktop, and now they weren't there anymore, right? And that's the essence of change. You're used to something, and now you're asking people to do something new. And so Dropbox didn't get a lot of traction. They were trying to figure out how to solve this problem. They thought about buying Google AdWords. They thought about advertising a bunch. What they decided to do was something quite interesting. They gave the service away for free. Anyone who wanted to use Dropbox could use up to 2 gigabytes of storage for free. Now, if you're sitting there going, wait, how do you make money giving away something for free? Any kid who's ever a lemonade stand knows you can't make money giving away something for free. But they didn't just give away something for free. They used a business model many of us know of as freemium. They gave away a free version of their service, but then they encouraged people to eventually upgrade to a paid version, one that would give you more storage and more features. They said, look, use this free version up until 2 gigabytes, but when you run out of storage, feel free to pay us for an upgrade. And many online businesses use freemium. Everyone from the New York Times and LinkedIn and Skype, Evernote, Pandora, basically almost every software as a service company uses some version of freemium. It's clear why customers like freemium. It's free, right? Why wouldn't they like something that's free? But companies like it as well, because notice what it does. Right? Anytime you're asking people to move from something old to something new, there's that uncertainty. Essentially, it's the cost of switching. Not only is it a monetary cost, it's a time, effort, there's an uncertainty cost of switching. What freemium does is it lowers the barrier to trial. Rather than having to pay all the monetary costs up front, it makes it cheaper, essentially, for people to try something. Because rather than you saying, hey, Dropbox is really good, which they're not going to believe, freemium lets people experience the value themselves. It allows them, by lowering the barrier to trial, it encourages them to say, well, do you like this thing? Check it out. And if you like it, right, then come pay me some money. And your listeners might be saying, well, hold on, I get it. Freemium's really useful if I'm Dropbox. It's really useful if I'm the New York Times. It's really useful if I'm Pandora. But I say there's a free version with ads. You want to get rid of the ads, pay for it. But how would I use this, right? I mean, what's freemium in real estate investing, for example? But what's neat about freemium is it's actually not freemium itself. It's an example of a much broader principle, which is lowering the barrier to trial. Think about buying a car, for example. You go to a car dealership. What they don't say is, hey, give me $30,000, and then I'll let you see if you like this car. What they say is, take a test drive. And if you like it, you'll be willing to pay to buy the car. Right? There's no free version, premium version. They lower the barrier to trial by not making you pay the money up front. Think about a sample of food, at least pre-COVID in the grocery store. You walk down an aisle, a sample of smoked sausage. If you like it, you're going to buy the product. There, it's not as much monetary cost, the cost of discovery, right? It's hard to find. There's so many things at the grocery store. What should you buy? Again, lowering the barrier to trial. Think about free shipping in sending people goods, right? I don't want to pay up front if I'm not sure I'm going to like this thing. Well, free shipping and free returns at least say, look, it's free. Check it out if you like it. If you don't like it, send it back. We'll give you your money back. Same with renting versus buying. All of these are ways of lowering the barrier to trial, allowing people to have some experience of the value themselves, rather than us again, right? The more it comes from us, the less interested people are going to be in it. How can we let them get there by themselves and experience by themselves so they discover the value, right? Lower those costs, figure out what is preventing this person from discovering this value, allow them to experience it themselves, and help them come to that decision on their own.
You are extremely good at this, right? This exact example. And it's interesting, while we were talking, you posed the question, how do you do that in real estate? And it's a very difficult question, because what we're selling is, please invest $25,000 minimum, right, in this bill. You can't give that away. So what you've been describing is what I've come to understand as extreme risk reversal, right? Where you give something away free, try it if you like it.
Reducing the risk, yes, reducing the risk.
Right. So you're reducing risk by giving something away free. Well, that's something that you do really well with free content, right? You can't hand out your books for free. I suppose you could. You could say, here, buy my book. I'm going to plug mine as well for a second. It was my podcast, but buy my book. Or, you know what? Order the book and don't pay for it until next week, right? Have it at home, read it. If you don't like it, send it back. We'll pay the shipping. That's one way of doing that. But another way of doing this, and this is what I've noticed when I ran a search for Jonah Berger or online, right? Everything is incredibly high value content. It's almost, I don't want to be crass about the quality of the content that you got out there, or the quality of the content that we have and that we put out, but it's high value, informative teasers, essentially, that draw you in, and you give something of value, right? Like Dropbox did, that was free, that says, look, if you like this, buy this. So I've got a question for you. In the world that you live, and then we'll wrap up, because I know you've got limited time. 3 quick questions, and I did think of the third one while we were talking, by the way. But in your world, you are not only do you teach marketing at one of the top universities in the world, have a PhD in marketing from one of the top universities in the world, and are extremely good at marketing. Let me ask you this question. Of all the things that you do to market your books, what is the most effective tool that you use? What is the most effective channel?
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you just said, I don't know that it's the most effective, but it's the one I personally believe in the most, is this notion of trying to give people an appetizer for free, right? This is actually why I wrote this book. So 2013, I wrote a book called Contagious that changed my life. Before that book, I was completely an academic, all research, all teaching. Published that book, suddenly I was getting calls from Google and Nike and Apple and Facebook and small startups and everybody in between who wanted help getting their stuff to catch on. I learned a lot about business from doing that. And there was a principle, though, that didn't make that first book, which was this notion of kind of reducing the barrier to trial, and allowing people to experience something themselves. And what I love about that idea at the core is, if what you're offering is good, you shouldn't have to sell it. Right? We think about a funnel often in marketing or persuasion general, awareness and then persuasion, right? If something's actually very good, you shouldn't need to have to persuade people. All you have to do is make them aware that it exists, but the world is busy, lots of stuff is going on. And so by giving away high value things, not everything, you don't want to give away the whole meal, because then, right, where do you have to create revenue? Just like freemium, give away something of value. If it's really good, if it's really useful for people, they'll come back for more, right? And so I agree, it's not always easy to apply this principle everywhere, but at the core, it's a really insightful idea. If what you're offering has value, then all you need to do is figure out how to find the people that believe in that value and allow them to experience it themselves. Because once they've experienced it, you don't need to persuade them, they've convinced themselves.
Exactly, right? They've come to trust you, and now they want more, and they're willing to write a check for that more. Before I sign off with these 3 last questions, I do want to make the point that you are the only academic, the only professor I know with nearly 200,000 LinkedIn connections. I've never seen anything like it in my life. I sit around patting myself on the back at the 15 or so thousand that I've got. And I work really hard at it. So something you're doing right.
Very kind of you.
3 quick rapid fire questions to sign off, if you don't mind. The first one, what are your key daily habits, personal habits, that keep you successful
Yeah, so people talk about this idea of big rocks, and I think it's a really good idea. Essentially, you've got things you want to do that are big, call those your big rocks. You've got things that you want to do that are small, answering email, finishing a little small things, those are your small rocks. The problem is if you start with your small rocks in your jar, there's never enough room for the big rocks, right? Because you need big blocks of time to do the big rocks. But if you put the big rocks in first, the small rocks will fill their way around the big ones, and you'll end up being able to do both. And if you don't believe me, by the way, try this at home. Take a jar, start with your small rock, then try to put the big rocks in versus the big rocks and then the small rock. And so I think that's really important. What are your big rocks, and how can you schedule your day or your week or your month to make sure you have time for them, right? So at the moment, I'm teaching the marketing core at Wharton. That's 6 hours a day on Monday and Wednesday. That's fine. Those are blocked off on my schedule. But I got to have time for research. When am I going to make time for that? And so I block off multi-hour chunks that I'm not going to get into email, that I'm not going to do other things. So I make sure to get the big rocks done. So at the end of the day, I have time for both the big ones and the small ones.
When I first started podcasting, right after I got my PhD, that changed my way of thinking of myself. I did a whole series interviewing professors of real estate. And in 95%, I'll just be straightforward, in the academic world, it's really obscure ideas. It's really, like my PhD is extremely obscure corner of finance history. For anybody listening, I looked at your list of papers. Every single one of them has practical value. For somebody interested in marketing, it's extraordinary anyway. So I'll put a link into that in the show notes. Second question of the last three. What's been the hardest lesson you've learned? Normally I say hardest lesson in real estate, hardest in business, but in this context that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that idea of keeping your audience in focus is always important. I talk to a lot of people, and as an academic, I deal with this myself sometimes, where I find something interesting, I find something valuable, and that's fine if it's a hobby. Right? Whatever you find valuable, if you want to, I don't know, collect obscure coins as a hobby, it doesn't matter whether anyone else cares about it. You could organize rocks in your backyard. If it's your hobby, fine. But if your goal is to make that thing into a business, whether that business is selling products, services, ideas, whatever it is, you have to have an audience, a customer, whether it's a true customer or not, who's interested in it. And I think too often we get enamored with things we like, but we don't think enough about who our customer is and what things they like. And so whether that's writing a book, writing an academic paper, finding an investment, it's less just about whether we like that thing, but making sure that we keep that customer in the fore, so we make sure we can interest someone else in that thing as well.
That is not an easy thing to do.
It's not easy, but it's possible.
Last question. Apart from buying all of your books, what advice would you give to somebody? And my world is real estate developers who, for the first time in history, have been allowed to actively market to raise money for their projects. What advice would you give to somebody listening now who has never marketed online, let's say before? What would be the key piece of advice that you would give them?
Yeah, I think look at what other people are doing in other industries. Innovative people, innovative companies are doing in other industries, and think about how you can bring it back into your industry, right? It's really easy to focus on just what you're doing today and the ways of doing business today, and sort of a small micro improvement in what you're doing that will make tomorrow or next week easier. But as we think longer term, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be, the more we're looking outside our industries, not just in our own industries, but outside our industries, the more we understand how business is being done more generally, and the more we can draw some lessons that are really valuable. One thing I loved about writing this book is take that example, providing a menu, right? I got that idea from talking to a great consultant, someone who sells essentially ideas for a living. And then I talked to a parenting expert who basically said the exact same thing. Said, when you're trying to get your kids to eat their vegetables or put their clothes on at night, give them a choice. Do you want to put on your pajamas first, your pajama top, or your pajama bottom? Do you want to eat your broccoli first or your chicken? And so it's not just about looking within one industry. It's really easy to be narrowly focused on your own industry, and I think that's good up to a point, right? Take your head a little bit out of that sand, look around, see what's going on in other spaces. It may not be useful tomorrow or next week, but in 5 years or in 10 years, it'll pay big dividends.
Marketing professor Jonah Berger at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, thank you sincerely so much for being on my show today. 6 hours a day of teaching is no trivial thing. Taking a break to spend it with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
That was Wharton professor Jonah Berger, author of The Catalyst and other books. Please go to the podcast page for today's episode at gowercrowd.com to find out more about Professor Berger, and to please check out my new book, Syndicate, where I discuss all the best practices for how to raise money online. It comes with a 72-minute free training from me, where I personally walk you through the whole process. You're going to absolutely love it, or guaranteed satisfaction or your money back. And that's all there at gowercrowd.com. Thank you so very much for listening. And thank you, Professor, author, and marketing machine extraordinaire Jonah Berger, for your time with me today. It was a great pleasure. Thank you. That's all for this episode. I'll see you next time. And in the meantime, stay well. And for now, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.